Thank you all for coming. I apologize in advance if I speak very quickly. I tend to, but I will try to speak very slowly this morning for the sake of you listening in Portuguese. Thank you so much, and again, thank you for coming at a relatively early hour. As the first speaker of the day, you're going to hear, of course, many great things about the intersection of technology, people, and real estate, and hear from many practitioners as sort of the state of the art of the field. I, as the first speaker, would like to sort of take a step back and look at some of the assumptions we have around the nature of work, particularly those of us who are involved, as almost all of us are these days, in the hunt for ideas. Our notion of work is to discover new things, discover new people, and to learn. Essentially, this is what most of us are actually in the field of doing, and that's why you're here this morning. And so therefore, before we get into whole notions of optimizing environments and sort of looking at the state of the art in office furniture design, I was reading the Herman Miller book that's in all of your seats this morning. I really want to start questioning about sort of the whole notion of how do we organize work in the first place. Because I think that the office, as someone who studies cities, I think that the office increasingly is a fundamentally flawed concept, no matter how we design it, no matter how we re-architect it. And I want to explain that today with the whole notion of serendipity. This is a subject that I'm writing a book about. It's something that I've gotten into as a student of cities, not of the workplace and of the nature of work. Cities are gigantic serendipity engines. They are where we bring people together to discover each other and discover new ideas. And therefore, they are hugely generative. They lead to new things all the time, whereas the office was designed to maximize efficiency. And I think there's a tension there that is worth exploring, and that's what I'd like to talk about this morning. But before I get into that, I want to take a step even further back, and let's reflect sort of notion on why companies and therefore the office exists. And that's why I have a sketch of this man. This is Ronald Coase. He was an economist who won the Nobel Prize. He died last year at the age of 103. And like many economists, Ronald Coase did his best work when he was a young man in his 20s, 75 years ago, when he wrote really the only essay to ever ask, why do companies exist at all? Why do firms exist? And so in the 1920s, when the corporation was still very young, he wrote an essay called The Nature of the Firm. And Coase, in this essay, laid out principles that are still true. No one's ever been able to improve upon them, which I think is fascinating as an economist. And basically what Coase identified, there are three things that companies do, which is why we need them. One is search. They look for talent and they basically organize it. The second is negotiation. A firm exists to basically contract with individuals and set out the parameters of work. And then the third thing they do is monitor work. Is the work being done? Is it being done to our satisfaction? And so Coase, what his great insight was, is that depending on the costs, each of these has a cost, you'll see very large integrated firms, if the costs of finding, negotiating, and monitoring talent is very high, or you'll see very, very small firms if the costs are very low. And so he called these transaction costs. When these costs are high, you end up with, of course, massive corporations like Dow and like many of the companies like General Motors and others and Petrobras and all the other companies that came into being or reached their apex in the middle of the 20th century when these transaction costs were very high. But the conditions today, as we all know, are very, very different. We're seeing very falling transaction costs. And this is why we're seeing to arise, in, of course, co-working, temporary workers, independent contractors. Theoretically, my magazine was famous, Fast Company. We famously published an essay in the mid-1990s called Free Agent Nation, where everyone would be an independent worker. And this, of course, is not true, but we seem to be headed in that direction very, very slowly. These are U.S. statistics which predict that by 2020, we could see as many as 65 million Americans be independent, temporary, contingent workers. And there's a study that was just released, from the field of co-working, for example, of course, people working in an office who are peers but not colleagues. That number is estimated to hit 1 million worldwide by 2018. And that is a phenomenon that essentially did not exist a decade ago. And so we're seeing this whole notion of how do you find talent when it is no longer in the office, when you are sending people outside of the actual building. This is a question we're all grappling with now. And so, of course, there are all examples of what Coase is talking about, this sort of unbundling of the corporation and unbundling of the office. One of which, of course, was outsourcing, a phenomenon that's 20, 30, even 40 years old, in which case you take units of the company and you move it out. You move it outside of your organization, perhaps you move it offshore. The second one, more recent, is ecosystems, the whole notion, the recognition that the firm is not the enterprise, is not the boundary of work, that any individual firm is part of a larger network of firms, all delivering value. And the most recent one of this is sort of the whole notion of crowdsourcing, which is the notion that there are individuals outside the firm who can provide tremendous value if you can find them through contests or through websites, mostly virtual so far, but we're starting to see this with the rise of co-working, another phenomenon, the rise of physical crowdsourcing, which I think is the most interesting phenomenon of all. And so the sort of meta trends that this leads to, which I think when you look at codes, is this whole notion of two things that come out of it. One is the notion of permeability. We're seeing companies becoming more open to new ideas and to new people outside of them, which is leading us away from the traditional office, of course, which was very closed, very secure, like the office building we are in. And then the second is this notion of the trade-off between size and scale. Corporations have achieved very, very large sizes. We have corporations with 500,000 workers or more in any given country. But I think organizations are realizing that's still not large enough. They need to get bigger in terms of their ability to attract and work with talent. And therefore, you need these sort of networks that go beyond the firm. And these are the sort of networks that I want to talk about today and sort of how you achieve them. Does anyone recognize what this is? It's a tree farm. This is a German tree farm. Those are thousands upon thousands of fir trees. It's very interesting. The Germans are actually very, very good at when it comes to tree farming. This is a very interesting system. You can look at it. You can see exactly what it is. You can sort of see, you think, its health from this height, wherever we are, thousands of feet up. But what's interesting is, the tree farms are very, very scalable. They're very, very manageable. And they're also very, very brittle. When they contract blight, they die by the tens of thousands. You can lose an entire farm. This is also a farm. This is a farm in Papua New Guinea in the Pacific. It's very hard to tell it's a farm, of course. It doesn't make any sense to most of us, unlike the tree farm. But it's actually a very, very elaborate polyculture. Every plant within that field is feeding something else, or sheltering it, is providing shade, is watering with its own sort of root system. It's an incredibly resilient, sustainable organization, even if it doesn't make any sense when you look at it. And I use these examples because these are examples used by an anthropologist at Yale named James C. Scott. He wrote a book called Seeing Like a State, in which he examined why certain attempts to build gigantic solutions to social problems had failed. The examples he used were the collectivization of farms in Africa and the Soviet Union, and other attempts to sort of massively organize systems. And he uses this notion of legibility versus illegibility. A legible system is like the tree farm. It's something that a centralized planner can look at, and it makes sense. You can control it from 30,000 feet, even though it's extremely brittle and very hard to understand conditions on the ground. And an illegible system is one, like the farm in New Guinea, which doesn't make any sense to the centralized planner, but if you are that farmer, if you are someone who is steeped in local knowledge and local tradition, it is an extremely resilient system that you can understand. And so this is a tension that Scott, when he looked into it, found in all of these systems. A legible system is closed but understandable. An illegible one is very difficult to understand but very open. And this is companies versus cities, for example. This is, to borrow the phrase from an essay about open source software, this is the cathedral approach to the bazaar, one of which you have several architects building a system. The other is open to anyone's contributions. This is the tension between Robert Moses, the master planner of New York, and Jane Jacobs, the patron saint of cities, who argued in favor of small villages like Greenwich Village in New York. And this is, of course, I think is the most interesting trend, is purposeful versus generative. A company, of course, is a closed system, is arguably brittle, but it's very purposeful. It understands what it's doing and why. And a city, of course, is very messy, sloppy, and even though it's gigantic and tremendously productive, a city doesn't have a purpose, per se. But I think it's sort of interesting, that when you look at, what is the office, what is the corporate equivalent of that tree farm? I would argue it's the office building, which we've, of course, been building the same way for nearly 100 years. This is the Seagram building, of course, in New York, the original sort of archetype for many of the mid-century modern office buildings. And we know today, through studies like the ones that Frank Duffy first did in the 1970s, I believe, that office utilization rates peak at something like 30% during the day. This to me is fascinating, because as a student of cities, it means that we are taking our greatest creation, our cities, and filling their cores with buildings that are empty most of the time, which strikes me as slightly strange. And then, of course, attempts to do this in office environments. This is Robert Probst, The Action Office. I was reading about it again in the worksheets you have in front of you. Probst attempted to design the Action Office as an illegible system. Workers could modify it to their own sort of design, and therefore it would basically be sort of their very localized knowledge, their own very personalized version of it. And of course, managers stepped in and made it extremely legible. in the form of the cubicle, which you could understand on floor plates. And so what I find interesting in speaking to facilities managers, the notion when it comes time to move offices is literally decided by someone who can lay down plans and start parceling out departments. All of this localized information, all the way the work gets done in our own heads. And then when it comes time to move or organize people, it's done on a sheet of paper, moving cubicles around. And I think there's something fundamentally, if not flawed, then it's reaching its limits. We're reaching the productive limits of this approach. And you can see this when you can design a city this way too. If there's a city in this world that was designed as a cubicle, it would be the pilot plan of Brasilia, of course, a city that Niemeyer and Costa designed from the air. When, of course, some of the most productive cities in the world are like Sao Paulo, or in this case, like Tokyo. Ones that are highly disorganized, ones that make no sense to the master planners because all of their interactions are done very, very local and done between people. And I think the interesting challenge, and one of the things I want to talk about and come to, is the notion of can we actually understand those interactions between people at some level without interfering in them, without breaking them up. And I think this is one of the great promises of technology, which I'll come to in a moment. But first I want to talk a bit about cities and why I'm going on about cities. There's been some very interesting research in the last few years by some physicists in the Santa Fe Institute in the United States, which is a think tank devoted to complexity science. Complexity science borrows from various scientific disciplines like physics, like chemistry, biology, and others, and combines it with mathematics to sort of understand very, very complex, difficult systems. And so one of the things they've been looking at is cities, and one of the questions they've asked is, why do cities get better as they get bigger, largely? And why do cities not die? I mean, the oldest inhabited cities on the planet right now is Damascus, which despite a civil war that is destroying the city, is tearing it apart, it continues to exist. And a city like Homs or Aleppo, for example, in Syria, to take dramatic examples, are essentially rubble. And yet they still function as communities. There are still people living there. And we see this over and over. Many cities have died, but of course, there's dead civilizations. But the city itself is an extremely resilient organism. While companies, and this is sort of thing where you can see that as cities get bigger, for example, the number of wages get better, and the number of super creatives attracted to them. There's something about them that actually, as they double in size, they also gain in properties, which is not something that happens in biological systems. This is also patents. This is agglomeration sizes for discovery. And so this is the most interesting chart to me. So this is a biological system, right? This is a human or a company. You are born, you mature, you reach middle age, and then eventually, not seen here, you die. And this is what cities do. They scale up with no upward bound, no life range, no nothing else. And so they're very, very different organisms. And I think there's something about the fact that because that they are this sort of open-ended system, they have properties that no actual company does. And so I'm very, very interested in how can we actually organize organizations to be more like cities and less like the company itself. And when you talk to the physicists, one of them is named Louise Betancourt, who recently published a paper asking, what is a city? Is a city a biological organism? Not really. Is it a machine for living, as Le Corbusier famously said? And that's not true either. What Betancourt decided is that cities are like the sun or like stars. They are gigantic reactors, fusion reactors that have put out light and heat in the form of new ideas, in the form of patents, in the form of all these positive things that we associate with cities. And the thing that's being compressed in cities, rather than hydrogen into helium, is people and social networks. We are taking dense networks of people and compressing them in space and time. And the healthiest cities are the ones that have the physical infrastructure, dense buildings, transport networks, plumbing, all electricity, Wi-Fi, all of these things that allow you to compress these cities tighter and tighter. And this is why, of course, Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro probably produce an outsized proportion of Brazil's GDP. In the United States, for example, something like the largest 100 metros in the United States produce 80% of our GDP. We see this over and over around the world. McKinsey has, of course, estimated that something like 600 cities around the world will produce 2/3 of all global growth over the next 20 years. The future belongs not just to cities, but to a handful of cities that possess these networks. And so I'm very, very interested in what is the special property of this? And one of my areas of research is in what I call what is known as informal economies. I'm very much looking at the people who are actively working outside of formal systems and formal taxation. And so this is some slides I borrowed from an Indian architecture firm called CRIT. They asked a very similar question. What is it that makes cities like Mumbai and areas like Dharavi somewhat special? Dharavi, of course, is the largest slum in India, and yet out of it comes $600 million in production per year. Walmart actually sources a lot of its manufacturing within India to very small firms within the slum. And what they found is that what slums do, very interestingly, is that unlike the office and unlike the formal economy, they have an incredible intensity of public space. You basically see, like this, entrepreneurs actually working cheek by jowl in the streets. Or they work in very, very small micro offices, compressing all of this work in space and time, sharing the pavement. There's a tremendous amount of energy packed into a very small amount of space. As you can see, that even in this sort of what looks like a very illegible slum system, is in fact a very, very highly organized, vertically integrated factory unit where people are also living. And so it's an incredibly efficient use of space with an incredibly efficient overlapping of activities. And so, the slum, which we regard as a dysfunctional condition, one that should be eradicated and one which many were during the 1960s and 70s, is in fact an incredibly high-functioning city, albeit one that lacks resources. And so CRIT, they came up with this whole notion, the phrase of transactional capacities. Slums lack resources, but they have tremendously high transactional capacities, much higher than any sort of formal CBD. And so one of the things they raise is, what is the optimum conditions for building a city or building a workplace? And so they came up with this chart. At one end, of course, you have, pure office skyscrapers, tons of resources, but very, very formal and very, very difficult for people to meet and activate. And at the other end, of course, you have slum settlements, areas that are incredibly entrepreneurial and incredible intensity, but yet people live in poverty and are essentially doomed to poverty because they lack all resources. And so, this notion of blur, how do you have this blurring of activity? Where does it reach its optimum? It reaches this point here in what they called old labor housing, which to me is very, very interesting because old labor housing, old neighborhoods that are being retrofitted and redesigned are exactly the kind of districts where young technology firms are going. This is particularly true in New York. This is what we're seeing in London, Berlin, Sao Paulo. We're seeing this sort of use of very, very small firms, very, very innovative firms are moving into this old housing areas of districts, not into glass skyscrapers. And so I think it's very interesting, what can we learn from this? And so my area of research is particularly, where the office and the city start blurring together. Rather than actually having firms organized in vertical skyscrapers, what happens when you basically start blurring the edge between the office and the city? And this is nothing new. This is interesting. I'm presenting this as a new idea, but in fact, historically, it's always been this way. This is a London coffee house in the 17th century. The first mobile worker, as we call them now, would probably be Samuel Pepys, the British clerk who famously kept a diary of his life in London in the 1670s. Samuel Pepys had an office very near to his home. He worked from coffee shops, he worked from pubs, he worked at the docks because he was a naval clerk, and famously sort of moved around all over London, conversing with people, learning from them. And of course, the coffee houses are famously attributed by Jürgen Habermas, the philosopher, as leading to the creation of what we now know as the public sphere, where people of various classes could meet and come together and lead to the creation of democratic institutions. It was a tremendously fertile space. And this, of course, led in time to the British Gentlemen's Club in the Victorian era of England. This is the, I forget the particular one I borrowed this slide from, but these are, of course, places where, places like Charles Dickens and Charles Darwin would come together, men of a certain social strata, but across various fields, where they could come together over dinner or drinks and discuss the ideas of the day. And again, you had this very diverse environment where people could come and exchange ideas, which you could not do, of course, in the social strictures of the time. And then, of course, this has evolved. We saw in the presentation, Dow Chemical in its various laboratories. The template for those labs was set by AT&T's Bell Labs in the 1930s and 40s. This is, of course, the labs where, unlike the offices of the day, which were open plan offices, this is a place where the lab technicians were mixed together by various professions. You had practitioners and theoreticians, you had metallurgists next to theoretical physicists, and then of course they'd put them in hallways where therefore you would always bump into someone so you could share your ideas. And this office layout, of course, was directly responsible for the creation of the laser, for radar, for satellites. AT&T Bell Labs in the 1960s was perhaps the most fertile, innovative environment that's ever been created. And of course, at the same time, you had at MIT in Boston a very similar lab. This was Building 42. It was built out of wood. It was designed to be a temporary structure during World War II. This was when it was finally torn down 40 years after it was supposed to be demolished. And again, this was a place where basically scientists could come together, wander the halls, knock down the walls, and run experiments through them in this very, very diverse, almost informal environment. It had many of the same properties, I think, as, essentially it was the university equivalent of a slum. It was unheated, it was hot in the summers, it was where they put the scientists so they didn't know what to do with them. And this is, of course, where Frank Duffy and later Stuart Brand formulated the whole notion of how environments should change, that you should have very, very fast changes on the inside, of course, at the office level, while the buildings themselves would change much more slowly. And this is exactly the kind of properties that they tried to develop when Frank Gehry designed the Stata Center, which now stands on the site of Building 42. And it is an attempt by the finest minds in office design, like Herman Miller and Steelcase and others, to formalize the various properties that Building 42 had. It was an attempt to basically build an office that acts like, with the same energies of a sort of scientific slum. And depending on who you ask, they would tell you how successful it is. Stuart Brand, who wrote How a Building Learns, famously described this building as an abortion, perhaps the strongest critique I've ever heard of a building. But Frank Gehry now, of course, is building a new headquarters for Facebook. And what I think is really, really interesting is that Gehry has not been asked to provide his architectural genius to it. Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, told him what he would build. He would build a very, very large building, one gigantic open hangar that is something like, I forget the conversion to kilometers being an American, but it's supposed to be a half a mile long and a quarter of a mile wide, and where 3,000 engineers will be under one roof. And the reason, of course, is Zuckerberg wants to put all of their desks on casters so that these teams might run into each other in the open field. The notion that, essentially rather than trying to organize them into space that is more efficient and organize them into work groups that they think can be the most productive, Mark Zuckerberg just wants Frank Gehry to leave his people alone. And he's hoping that some sort of emergent order will come out of it, that basically serendipity will strike. And so therefore I want to talk for a moment about serendipity and why we're seeing the evolution of the office towards these floor plates. And this is true whether you talk to Google, whether you talk to Amazon's new headquarters in Seattle, where they're literally building offices that blur with the city. If you talk to the architects, and I'm sure you know this yourselves, there's a sort of trend towards this notion of serendipity. How do we cultivate these unplanned encounters? And so, of course, the phrase serendipity is a strange word. It's untranslatable out of the English in many languages. But it's this notion of the happy accident, the notion of something that is unplanned, a discovery of something that you weren't even looking for. And so, the most famous examples are scientific, penicillin, antibiotics, classic example of serendipity in which Alexander Fleming realized that after mistakenly leaving out a sample, mold spores had essentially attacked and eaten his bacteria, leading to the whole classes of antibiotics. There are tons of discoveries like this. Dynamite, Kevlar, Nike running sneakers, all of these are cases of serendipity. And so I think it's sort of interesting is, and this comes back to it, is, why is it that we formally organize hierarchies of people in formal spaces to search for new ideas when we in fact know that so many discoveries and so many great ideas cannot be planned? How do we bring together the right people at the right place at the right time when we don't know who those people are and we don't know what the right place or the right time is? And this is sort of the challenge, right? This is this whole notion of sort of engineering serendipity. The title of my talk is, how do we do a better job of that? Rather than trying to basically lay out an office environment that we think is going to have the most sort of efficient formal structure, how do we do a better job of creating these fertile places and fertile networks where people can come together and create things that we have no ability to anticipate? And one way, I guess one way of thinking about serendipity about this, when we're trying to sort of organize it, is to think about social networks. And I don't mean social networks like Facebook or Twitter or any of those. I mean in the sense of whenever you have more than two people present, you have an invisible social network connecting them, how they are related. And of course, you can study this, you can graph it, you can network it together. And because we have the technology, it's more efficient to do this than ever. But the question is why, and I think these questions have been answered very conclusively by a number of scientists. This one is Ronald Burt at the University of Chicago. He's also an economist and sociologist. And for 40 years, he's been studying a trend that he calls structural holes. These are the gaps that inevitably arise within organizations, where some people know each other and some people don't. And so you see, these sort of, this is 256 executives of a large pharmaceutical firm, for example, where, instead of thinking that everyone, of course, is organized along, hierarchical flow charts, in fact, work gets done in very, very messy, organic ways that we can go back and look at. And so Bert, he explained to me that what's interesting about this is this is, of course, I believe it's this is a large multinational organization, and when he basically mapped the 256 most important executives, he found that the best connected people in it were not the CEO, were not the heir apparents. It was a random executive over here who was tying together multiple geographic locales and other sort of essential choke points in here. These individuals who were the only things keeping these units tied together. And so, one of the pressing questions that he presented to them, and which they immediately tried to fix is how do we go about, elevating these people to greater positions of authority, and how do we go about connecting these units over here, which, represent billions of dollars, but are essentially isolated from the leadership of the rest of the organization. We can see this now, and we can start to organize for it. And just as an aside, the organization that's most interested in engineering serendipity is the American intelligence community. Most of the technology tools I'm going to show you were first developed, in fact, essentially for anti-terrorism. But there's all sorts of interesting new social networks being devised. This is one that I recently wrote about for Inc. magazine in the United States called Relationship Science. Relationship Science is a company that took several years and hundreds of people. They sourced tens of thousands of databases, about 3 million people, the most influential people in American and international business, and then built basically a database using publicly available information to see how they were all connected via past employers, via school, via organizations, via stock holdings, all of which you could source from public databases. And so essentially what you could do is you can ask the system, how am I connected to this person? And it will show you how, and it will show you the people in between, and it will show you, this is color-coded, the strength of your connections. And it can start doing this dynamically. So you can basically start seeing how you are connected to anyone else in its entire database or vice versa. And you can take it a step further. Organizations using it can essentially see how they're connected to other people in other organizations. So you can see, for example, how are we, as a firm, once you start pooling together all of your employees' connections, you can see, what industries are we connected to? In this case, how are we connected to private equity and venture capital? Who are we connected to? What organizations are we connected to? You can start seeing very, very visually, very, very quickly how you are socially organized and how your business actually is sort of socially constructed. And so, you can go through various phases in here. I think this is a very indicative piece of software because it has a level of context and granularity that Facebook and Twitter will never have. We're starting to reach the point where you can actually build software that can not only tell me that I'm connected to this person, but it can tell me everything that we have in common, potential commonalities, and why we'd want to get to know each other. And you can use this sort of software within the organization and outside of it. And then, of course, we're adding capabilities to this over time. So this is another new company. I literally spoke to them this week. They're called Rexter. They use software that passively monitors your email, your communications, your meeting, your calendars, your calls, and starts organizing to-do lists for employees based on monitoring who they're in touch with the most. So we can start building more and more impressive maps of who is actually doing work within the organization or outside of it, and then from there predicting who should be working together, who should be speaking but is not, who should be working together but isn't currently. And then we can start doing this with physical sensors in the workplace. These are some slides borrowed from my friend Ben Weber. He was at MIT, at the MIT Media Lab. He runs a company called Sociometric Solutions. And they sell sensors like this. It's about the size of your iPhone or Android phone, and it hangs around your neck like a lanyard. So instead of having an employee lanyard, you would wear this. And it has, Bluetooth, it has accelerometer, so it can follow where you go. It also listens to conversations, not to their content, but who is speaking and in what turns. And so you can use it, for example, in a meeting if you're all wearing this. It will record and analyze who's doing most of the talking and in what sequences, who's really sort of leading this sort of meeting. And we'll passively create this, organize it, analyze it, and so you can start to see, who's actually sort of, leading conversations and leading this. And then you can also see sort of the level of interaction with them in the company, and then you can also see when that meeting is over where they're going afterwards. And so you can start creating these sort of real-time maps of how and where work is being done. One of his case studies, for example, was Bank of America, and a large retail bank in the United States, of course. And so, he tested it within a call center office and also in retail branches. This is the retail branch in particular, to see, how people were actually organized. And so, so in this retail bank, then once he saw their organization, he was then able to map it against their performance metrics. And, which do you think is the most highest performing in here? 1, 2, or 3? The highest performing bank branch of these 3 that he looked at, of course, was number 1. This is the one that has the least structural holes. It is the most connected, it's the most cohesive. The second highest performing was this one, which, is very, very tight. There's a very strong click in the middle, but there's several people who are completely isolated out there. Their resources being wasted. And of course, the least functional one was branch number 2. And the reason it's split in 2 like that is because this office was split on 2 separate floors. Which is interesting because it goes to show that those studies done in the 1970s, that when you place people on separate floors of an office, they might as well not exist, or at least that level of interactivity that you presume is never there. And this, of course, is true across all communications. We're still seeing studies today that show that the people that you email the most and talk to the most via the phone are still the people that you are in the closest physical contact with, which means that we need to do a much better job of organizing people spatially to enhance these sort of networks, virtually and otherwise. And so the question of engineering serendipity, can we actually start knitting these networks together? I think that's increasingly true. This is another new organization called People Science, not to be confused with relationship science. These names all sound similar. And so this is a group of individuals who are working with a Swiss software company. They all belong to very large corporations. The one I spoke to works for United Health Group, one of America's largest health insurers. And so they're trying to figure out ways and developing methods so that you can take a network map like this where, here's an IT group, here's sales, here's another group that, of course, is completely unconnected. And then once you understand this is what it looks like, you can develop exercises, spatial interventions, technology, so that at the end of 3 months of prep, it looks like this, which you can then map against your performance metrics and know that you built a higher functioning, more efficient, more productive, more innovative organization than the one that was separated like this. And so, they're developing software that can not only sort of, start tying these networks together, but then also identify, what is it they have in common, and then sort of start using this to actually start building out these network, exercises. And I think this is interesting because, again, we can't dictate how these people know each other. We can't dictate how they'll interact. But the technology is providing those of us who manage, facilities and manage offices, the ability to at least see what's actually going on inside the organization, rather than simply doing space layouts and then laying the org chart against them. And so then, of course, the importance then becomes, how do we do this in physical space, or what are the actual physical implications of this? And so we're seeing, innovative new forms of software and organization, like this is Serendipity machine out of the Netherlands. This is an attempt to lay a virtual layer on top of an actual co-working space, like Seats to Meet and some others. In this case, you sign up for Serendipity machine. When you enter a co-working space, you agree to essentially say, this is the kind of work I'm doing, this is my particular skills and expertise, this is what I can contribute to the community. And so when you're physically present, everyone there in the space knows, via screens that are actually around the workspace, what you do and what it is you can contribute. So you can actually sort of find that expertise and tap into it. And we're seeing this, sort of the next evolution of co-working. Of course, co-working started as, a workspace where peers, but not necessarily colleagues, could come together and work side by side, which, can lead to serendipity. You can discover new experts and new collaborators, but not always. And so we're seeing attempts by co-working companies like WeWork in New York, which is massively internationally expanding, looking to expand to London, Berlin, Tel Aviv, elsewhere, is trying to design co-working environments where you can take these ecosystems of freelancers and organize them in new ways. And so one of the things they're doing, they call it WeWork Labs. This is the one that sits in New York, Soho, where an industrial designer and architect named Dror Bentry was essentially asked to bring all of his collaborators, all of his freelance architects, designers, laser cutters, technicians all together, and invite them to share the same sort of physical space. And so therefore, essentially, you brought together an ecosystem of designers and architects in the same space, even though none of them necessarily work for each other. And there's a funny story about this. The CEO of WeWork told me, recently that, 2 of the architects in this space of 150 people, managed to fool a Chinese client into thinking this was their architectural office. And so they had these Chinese airport officials came into the office, and the 2 architects, without telling anyone, told them, yes, this is our firm. Yes, we have the capacity to do the work. And the Chinese, totally bought the story. And of course, the happy ending is that once they had the business, they then actually started farming it out to all of the people in the office. And so something like 60 or 70 people managed to get work out of this. And I think this is interesting because, this is a pool of expertise that no single organization can bring in-house. But as, WeWork has seen, companies like American Express and others have started inserting teams into these spaces to discover these pools of experts and figuring out ways to work with them. And then, of course, I don't want to lecture too long about co-working. I know you're very familiar with this. But we're starting to see this sort of try to rise to larger and larger scales. So this is the San Francisco Chronicle building in San Francisco, where Yahoo has just set up 70,000 square feet of space. And there's of course a co-working installation of the Hub there, the famous international chain, and the whole notion of the developers of this who want to build 2 million square feet, 200,000 square meters of office space. Before they build anything, they're building this community of co-workers and technicians and metal fabricators to provide that as a service to the companies that will later set up shop there. They're using co-working and using this sort of community as a way to create value for future tenants. And then one of the most interesting experiments, which Wired magazine is writing a story about at the moment, is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. This is Grid 70, if you're unfamiliar with it. This is where 6 very, very large companies decided to put all of their creative teams in the same place. So this is Steelcase, Herman Miller's arch rival. Also Wolverine Sporting Goods, which makes shoes. Meijer, which is a grocery store chain. There's a healthcare company. There's several others. All of whom took their design teams in the case of Wolverine, or their business development teams in the case of Steelcase or Amway, the marketing company, and moved them from their suburban headquarters into this space in downtown Grand Rapids. And what was interesting to me is the goal of it was, their express goal was to create serendipity. It was the notion of they can learn faster from each other and in unknown ways than they could if they simply worked with their colleagues back in the suburban headquarters. It was better for their designers and creatives to be around other creatives and to be around people working in human resources or in accounts. And so I think it's interesting that with the other part of this building, which is fascinating to me, is that it's expressly designed to share ideas. There is no worries about intellectual property. Everyone who is present has signed a building-wide NDA. There's also a gentleman's agreement that if you come up with an idea that's good for one of the other companies and it's in their expertise, they will be the ones who get to develop it. And so they're trying to create this very efficient structure where people can learn from each other faster and lead to these sort of serendipitous ideas that could perhaps lead to potential products. And no one has come up with $1 billion product out of this yet. But it is sort of leading to basically a sort of faster iteration. They're able to learn and iterate products much faster. And this is the stated hope of maybe the most ambitious version of this. This is Zappos out in Las Vegas, in downtown Las Vegas, where Tony Hsieh, the CEO of Zappos, has moved his company from its suburban headquarters into a new campus in the former City Hall of Las Vegas, which is an open campus. He's basically allowed outsiders to come in and work alongside his employees in the lobby and other co-working spaces inside, and is encouraging his own employees to leave the office as much as possible to go work in spaces around downtown Las Vegas. Because Tony Hsieh, of course, is building what he calls the Downtown Project. He spent $350 million of his own money he received from Amazon when he sold the company to them 5 years ago, and is using it to buy property and build a sort of creative class company town, complete with new restaurants, new co-working spaces, health clinics, schools, everything else, because Tony, having read the same literature I have read, believes that Zappos will evolve as a company only if it achieves the sort of scale of a city. And so he's also invested in all these startups and has encouraged all of these very small tech companies to move to Las Vegas. So basically, he has a pool of talent in which he can hire into Zappos, or which his own employees can learn from. And I think this is fascinating because we're basically sort of seeing this evolution where he is actively trying to make his company more like a city. And so what is the point I'm trying to build towards here? I'm coming to I think there's sort of three things happening, and this is my interest as someone who's involved in cities. And that is the notion, that basically, mobile devices, my interest in this started from the notion of, will mobile devices help or hurt cities? And I think, mobile devices are what is allowing us to navigate cities in new ways that we never could before. It allows us to see into buildings and allows us to use workspaces and find people in ways we couldn't. And cities, what cities are best at is serendipity. And so therefore, I think what we're going to start seeing, partly because of experiments like Zappos and Downtown Project, and partly because of the capabilities on our mobile phone, I think we're going to start seeing people leave the office. I think we're going to start seeing the nature of work move beyond very, very flexible office space. Herman Miller, I only point this out because I was reading this very beautiful booklet beforehand where they were showing the notion of the living office, where one of the various configurations in there is described as plaza. Instead of trying to recreate the dynamics of the city inside the office, I think we're going to start seeing people leave the office to go work in new arrangements in the city. Co-working is only the first example. I think we're going to see new types of public spaces designed for work. I think we're going to see new working arrangements. Perhaps you should be inviting strangers, or I say peers and colleagues from other firms to work inside your office, especially if they're from partners or suppliers. Or perhaps you should embed your own people in other offices, for example. I think we're going to start seeing all of these things happening, and I think the city is pivotal of this because the city, of course, is at a scale of, of firms and ecosystems that no single office building or organization can ever be. And so, of course, the original version of this was the Manhattan Street Grid, an attempt to organize space in a very legible manner. And today, now we have things like Foursquare. This is a map of my check-ins around the city. You can see I live here in Brooklyn Heights, and you can see my office is here in Dumbo in Brooklyn. And then, of course, these are the various spaces I've checked in, restaurants, bars, co-working spaces. And then, of course, you can start using this, as Foursquare has done, to start building predictive maps to understand where I will be and what I am looking for at any given hour. We can start doing this for work as well. And then, of course, we can start using it to find people, which I think is the strongest, potential application of these phones and workspaces. So this, of course, is Tinder. I don't know if Tinder has made its way to Brazil yet. Tinder is the hottest dating app, of course, in the United States. And what's interesting about Tinder is that unlike any other sort of dating apps, is that it's very proximate. You're looking for people who are close to you at that particular moment. And so it's not a question of, who's the best match for me. It's who's the best match right now. This is very easy to do in dating. It's a little bit harder in a business context, but this comes back to what I was saying earlier about doing network analysis in depth, is that we can start figuring out who we want to find for business purposes as well. I maybe want to look for, a date near me, but I also may want to look for someone who can actually do JavaScript development as well, or perhaps someone, who's in the same firm as I am, or someone, who's related to the work I'm doing. I'm curious, who's around me at this conference? Who else is here in this building, et cetera? And so we're seeing, new apps like this. This is Social Radar, which is trying to do that for business. They're trying to be the Tinder of work. And then we can start doing this at spatial designs as well. This is a new capability designed by a company called Liquid Space, which does office space on demand, basically trying to be the Airbnb of the office. And so they have a new capability where, I don't want to pick a space to work in. I want to work alongside Mark, who's the CEO of Liquid Space. So where's Mark working today? And so therefore, they're actually creating maps now where you can basically go into an organization and choose, where someone is checked in inside this co-working space or inside this office space. And you can start figuring out who you want to work with. And again, we could also engineer it on the backside so that basically you could press a button that says, who should I work with today, or do I feel lucky? And you can actually have the system start directing you to people that you should be working with. And you can basically figure out how you want to work. And this is only going to get more and more interesting as we start seeing wearables come into the field, things like Google Glass. I think it's starting to become a consensus that Glass itself is a failure. But I think much like the original version of portable devices, like the Apple Newton 20 years ago, I think Glass portends that at some point will get the form factor and the capabilities right, and you will have this level of augmented reality, in which case the city will start becoming visible to you. And this goes beyond serendipity per se, or perhaps it's a larger version of serendipity, but I think this is really interesting because at some point the whole city is going to become a whole set of choices for us. We're going to be able to see the city in ways we never could before. Who is near us, who is coming at us around the corner, but also we're going to be able to see inside of office spaces and see all of this underutilized space. It's only a matter of time before a company like Airbnb decides to move into the office space, and you're going to be able to start renting conference rooms on a moment-by-moment basis, or reserving them for free, which again comes back to the whole notion of, once you start putting your office space up on Airbnb to, realize a little bit of spare change or allow people to work out of your lobby, the question becomes, why aren't you actively trying to figure out who should be working within your office building? And again, you can use this sort of software to do that. I think it's interesting, for example, with Airbnb, just as an aside, I was staying here in Sao Paulo at the Grand Hyatt. Airbnb, with no assets at all, has a higher valuation than the entire Hyatt chain at this point. People are realizing these networked resources and what Airbnb or Liquid Space can do with the office and how we can basically start increasing the intensity of the cities we have. It's massive potential. And so, just as a sort of utopian version of where I think this is all headed, 15 years ago, the Japanese architect Hitoshi Abe, who's now at UCLA, he imagined something he called Mega House, which was essentially the ultimate co-working chain before it existed. It was, you literally, approached homeownership as a membership service. Instead of owning a house, you would subscribe to Mega House, and you could go across cities like Sao Paulo or New York or anywhere, and you would find rooms inside of buildings, and you could basically customize that room to be your office for the day or your living room or for anything else. And there'd be biometrics, and there'd be club memberships, all these sorts of things. It was the whole notion of space as a service taken to its extreme. And I think this is one area in which we're going, which is the whole notion of, that rather than work in a single building with a single set of coworkers, we're now adding the capabilities, and we're now reaching the imperative where we need to find these much larger networks of people, and we need to find them in physical space. And there's experiments happening like this as well. I'm just going to end with one final example of who's thinking about this. This is a project that's going on inside right now at Gensler, London, where they want to take the Aldgate neighborhood they work in and start blurring the space between their office and the public space using things like wearables and other memberships. And so this is an example where they imagined, this sort of couple square blocks would be a membership sort of co-working space, but it would include, multiple office spaces. It would include, this sort of notion of Pitcher's Corner where you can talk about business plans in a particular piece of public space. Or you could actually have little office cubes inserted into the street where you'd have Wi-Fi if you needed to sit down and tap out some emails rather than a park bench. The whole notion of this, again, blurring between the office and parks and public space was going to happen because, again, it allows us to find people faster. And also because who wouldn't want to work in a park when given the chance? And so, this is something that we're thinking about right now, by the way, at OMA. I'm working on a project with this in partnership with the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, Rem Koolhaas's firm, to start reimagining, what are the ways in which people are going to work and how do we start rethinking the use of space. We're talking to Ericsson right now because, of course, mobile telecom companies are the ones that are most interested in sort of how this future will come to pass, because anything that increases their mobile traffic is good to them. But this is just an image from, this is REM laying out their buildings. I think it's sort of interesting because it starts changing the whole approach to architecture and facilities management and all the professions that deal with the commissioning and building of space. Because it goes from, building models in foam where you imagine a new building to what if you look at the whole city and you start picturing that all of this potential in here, that all of the buildings we have is the building spaces of tomorrow and the new office spaces of tomorrow. So just one final thought in conclusion. I know there's been a lot to cover here and I hope you have questions. Is that, traditionally the office and the organization were created for economies of efficiency and scale, of course, right? The original office was a factory for doing paperwork, to process, known quantities of work as fast and as efficiently as possible. And today, in knowledge work and discovery of new ideas, what we're trying to do is increase the amount of exposure and to inputs, to bring ideas and people into the organization and into the firm. And so rather than think about it as a factory for paperwork, we need to start thinking about, designing physical spaces, synapses. How do we increase the number of contact points, at least for any profession or any role, in which case, bringing new ideas in and learning from someone is the sort of central part of your job. And so this is sort of things I'm trying to get at in sort of these various experiments. How do we use technology and overlay it onto space so therefore we can actually increase exposure? How do we find people faster and more efficiently there and find these commonalities faster? Because this is, of course, what cities have always done, right, is compress these people in space and time to create these suns. And what I'm very interested in is how we can actually use workspace and use social networks and use technology, I guess you could say, to increase the heat of those suns. So with that, thank you very much, and I hope you'll have some questions. Thank you.